What if the biggest thing keeping you trapped in the poverty cycle isn't your paycheck, your job, or the economy? What if it's something you've been carrying inside for years without even realizing it? In just a few moments, you're going to hear the story of two ordinary Americans whose lives looked completely different on the outside, yet they were both caught in the exact same invisible pattern. One worked harder every year, but somehow always ended up back at zero. The other finally discovered a single shift that changed the way he related to money, fear, and himself. And that's when everything slowly began to change. Before you assume this is another promise of overnight wealth, stay with me, because it isn't. This is about something far deeper than making more money. It's about uncovering the hidden belief that quietly shapes every financial decision, every opportunity you accept or reject, and every feeling you experience when money enters or leaves your life. By the end of this journey, you may discover that the prison you've been trying to escape was never locked from the outside. And once you recognize the one thing that has been running beneath the surface all along, you may never look at poverty, abundance, or even yourself the same way again. Most people believe that poverty begins the day their bank account runs low. They believe it starts with a small paycheck, an unexpected bill, or an opportunity they never received. That explanation sounds reasonable because it is visible, measurable, and easy to point to. But what if those were only symptoms instead of the true beginning? Imagine waking up every morning determined to build a better life. You work longer hours. You spend less. You watch videos about success, budgeting, investing, and personal growth. For a while, it feels as though everything is finally moving in the right direction. Then something unexpected happens. A surprise expense appears. A promising opportunity slips away. Self-doubt quietly returns. Before long, you find yourself standing in the exact same place where you promised you would never be again. If this pattern feels familiar, you are far from alone. Rachel Miller knew this feeling better than anyone. She was responsible, hardworking, and disciplined. Her coworkers admired her dedication. Her friends described her as reliable. Every January, she promised herself that this would be the year everything changed. She created spreadsheets, tracked every dollar, skipped unnecessary purchases, and accepted extra projects whenever they became available. Yet every December, she looked at her finances with the same heavy question in her heart. Why did progress always disappear just when it finally seemed within reach? She blamed inflation. She blamed bad timing. She blamed herself. What she never questioned was the invisible story running quietly beneath every decision she made. Most people never question that story either because it feels like reality instead of belief. It whispers that there is never enough. It insists that security is always somewhere in the future. It convinces you that you must constantly struggle to deserve peace. Over time, that quiet voice becomes so familiar that you stop hearing it altogether. You simply call it life. The remarkable thing about the human mind is that it protects familiar patterns even when those patterns create pain. Familiar feels safe. Predictable feels comfortable. Even scarcity can become emotionally familiar after enough years. That is why two people with similar incomes can experience money in completely different ways. One sees possibility where another sees danger. One notices opportunity while another expects disappointment. The difference often begins long before either person earns their first paycheck. It begins with the emotional meaning they attach to money, worth, safety, and receiving. Before any number changes, before any investment grows, before any career advances, something much deeper quietly shapes every choice. And unless that deeper layer is recognized, the same cycle can repeat through different jobs, different cities, and even different stages of life, while wearing a different disguise each time. Rachel Miller never thought of herself as someone who had a negative relationship with money. If anyone had asked, she would have said she respected it, managed it carefully, and wished she had more of it. From the outside, her life seemed stable. She had a full-time job, paid her bills on time, and avoided unnecessary debt whenever possible. Friends often complimented her discipline because she never appeared reckless or impulsive. Yet there was one private ritual she never spoke about. Every time she opened her banking application, she paused for just a moment before looking at the balance. That brief hesitation lasted only a second, but it carried years of quiet anxiety. She expected disappointment before she even saw the numbers. Sometimes the balance was better than expected, yet relief lasted only a few minutes before another worry appeared. What if the car needed repairs? What if the rent increased? What if the company reduced staff? What if one unexpected event erased everything she had worked so hard to save? Those thoughts did not arrive because of the amount of money she had. They arrived because they had become automatic. Rachel remembered moments from childhood that had seemed ordinary at the time. She remembered overhearing late-night conversations between her parents about unpaid bills. She remembered her mother saying that money always disappeared as quickly as it arrived. She remembered family gatherings where successful people were quietly described as lucky, dishonest, or different from ordinary families like theirs. None of those conversations were intended to limit her future. They were simply expressions of fear spoken by people doing their best to survive difficult seasons. But children rarely separate facts from emotions. Instead, they absorb emotional patterns as though they are universal truths. Without realizing it, Rachel carried those invisible lessons into adulthood. Every financial decision passed through an emotional filter she did not know existed. Saving money felt responsible, but receiving more money somehow felt uncomfortable. Asking for a higher salary made her feel guilty instead of confident. Investing felt risky even after careful research because deep inside she believed security could disappear without warning. She was not responding only to her present circumstances. She was responding to emotional memories that had quietly shaped her expectations for years. This is how invisible patterns survive. They are rarely announced with dramatic thoughts. Instead, they appear as ordinary habits, familiar worries, and unquestioned assumptions that seem completely reasonable. Over time, those assumptions become the lens through which every opportunity is viewed. When an unexpected opportunity appears, the mind searches for reasons to doubt it. When success begins to grow, an old fear whispers that it cannot last. The cycle continues not because life is determined to punish us, but because familiar emotional patterns keep recreating familiar responses. Rachel did not know it yet, but the real turning point in her journey would not begin with a larger paycheck or a better investment. It would begin the moment she became willing to question the quiet voice she had mistaken for reality all her life. Several weeks later, Rachel accepted an invitation from a friend to attend a small community discussion about personal growth. She almost declined because she assumed it would be another conversation about budgeting, investing, or working harder. She had heard those ideas many times before. Instead, one simple question caught her attention. The speaker asked, "What emotion appears first when you think about money?" Rachel expected practical advice, yet the room became silent. She realized she had never asked herself that question. She had always focused on numbers, goals, and plans, but never on the emotion that appeared before every financial decision. As she quietly reflected, the answer surprised her. The first feeling was not excitement or gratitude. It was tension. It was the expectation that something could go wrong at any moment. That realization stayed with her long after the meeting ended. During the following days, she began paying attention to moments she had previously ignored. Whenever she received her paycheck, relief lasted only briefly before worry returned. Whenever she considered asking for a promotion, an inner voice suggested that she should simply be thankful for what she already had. Whenever she imagined genuine financial freedom, another thought immediately insisted that people like her rarely experienced that kind of life. None of those reactions were based on evidence in the present moment. They arrived automatically, almost as if they had been rehearsed thousands of times before. The more Rachel observed without judging herself, the more clearly she recognized a hidden pattern. Her actions were not creating her deepest beliefs. Her deepest beliefs were quietly shaping her actions. This idea challenged everything she had assumed about change. She had spent years trying to force different results while carrying the same emotional blueprint. It was like planting healthy seeds in soil that had never been cared for. The effort was real, but the foundation remained unchanged. Around that same time, Rachel came across the Hawaiian practice of Hooponopono. She did not see it as a magical solution or a promise of instant wealth. Instead, what captured her attention was a simple principle. Before trying to change the outside world, begin by cleaning what is happening inside. That idea felt unfamiliar because it shifted responsibility without creating shame. It did not accuse her of causing every hardship. It simply suggested that every lingering fear, every inherited belief, and every emotional memory could influence how she experienced life today. Rachel did not fully understand how such a practice could affect her relationship with money, but she sensed that she had finally reached the edge of a different path. For the first time in years, she stopped asking, "How can I make more money?" and started asking a quieter, more powerful question. What part of me still believes that I must live in constant lack? That single question opened a door that no budgeting strategy had ever been able to unlock, and behind that door waited a completely different understanding of abundance, one that began not with the balance in a bank account, but with the beliefs carried in the human heart. For the next several days, Rachel resisted the urge to search for another financial strategy because she sensed that her greatest obstacle was no longer a lack of information. She already knew how to create a budget. She understood the importance of saving consistently, avoiding unnecessary debt, and planning for the future. None of those lessons were wrong. They were valuable, practical, and worth following. Yet they all assumed that the person applying them felt emotionally safe receiving abundance. Rachel slowly realized that this assumption was not always true. One evening, she sat quietly with a notebook and decided to write down every thought that entered her mind whenever she imagined having complete financial freedom. At first, the answers sounded positive. She would travel more often. She would help her family. She would have more time. But after sitting in silence for another few minutes, deeper thoughts surfaced without warning. What if people expected too much from me? What if I lost everything? What if money changed who I was? What if I disappointed everyone? She stared at the page, surprised that fear appeared more quickly than excitement. Those thoughts had never been intentionally chosen. They had simply been waiting beneath the surface. This was the insight that gradually changed the direction of her journey. Hooponopono does not begin by trying to force external circumstances to obey our wishes. Instead, it invites us to take responsibility for cleaning the memories, emotional reactions, and unconscious patterns through which we experience the world. Responsibility in this context is not blame. It is the willingness to acknowledge that while we cannot rewrite yesterday, we can change the relationship we have with the memories we continue to carry today. Rachel found that distinction deeply comforting. She no longer needed to accuse herself of creating every difficulty. She only needed the courage to notice what had been silently influencing her choices. As she learned more about the practice, she discovered that many people described repeating for simple phrases as a way of releasing emotional burdens rather than fighting against them. Whether someone viewed the practice through a spiritual lens, a psychological lens, or simply as a mindful exercise, the intention remained remarkably similar. Instead of resisting painful memories, they acknowledged them with compassion and gradually loosened the emotional grip those memories held. Rachel decided to experiment with this approach during ordinary moments rather than waiting for a crisis. When anxiety appeared while paying bills, she observed it instead of immediately believing it. When fear surfaced after checking her savings, she reminded herself that emotions were not always facts. Little by little, something subtle began to change. Her financial situation had not transformed overnight, but the constant feeling of danger started to soften. For the first time in years, she noticed brief moments of calm where fear had once appeared automatically. Those quiet moments seemed almost insignificant, yet they marked the beginning of a deeper transformation, because lasting change often begins long before the outside world provides visible proof. As Rachel continued this quiet practice, she noticed something unexpected. The greatest changes were not happening in her checking account. They were happening during ordinary moments that most people would never consider important. One Saturday morning, while walking through a neighborhood farmer's market, she caught herself comparing her life with everyone around her. A couple laughed while carrying fresh flowers. A young family talked excitedly about an upcoming vacation. Someone nearby casually mentioned buying a new home. Normally, Rachel would have smiled politely while feeling a familiar weight settle inside her chest. She would have quietly concluded that everyone else had somehow figured life out while she was still trying to catch up. This time, however, she paused. Instead of accepting that feeling as truth, she simply observed it. She recognized it as another familiar emotional pattern asking to be noticed rather than obeyed. That single moment changed more than she expected because awareness interrupted a reaction that had repeated for years. Later that afternoon, she opened her journal again and wrote a sentence that surprised even her. She realized she had never truly feared having too little money. What she feared most was never feeling like she was enough. Suddenly, dozens of memories connected together like pieces of a puzzle. She remembered receiving praise only after working harder than everyone else. She remembered believing that rest had to be earned. She remembered apologizing whenever someone did something kind for her because receiving support felt uncomfortable. She even remembered feeling guilty whenever life became easier, almost as though struggle had become proof that she deserved whatever she achieved. Money had quietly become connected to identity instead of simply being a practical tool. If she unconsciously believed she was only worthy through sacrifice, then every experience of ease felt unfamiliar. Every opportunity that arrived without struggle seemed suspicious. Every season of stability felt temporary because a deeper belief insisted that peace could not last. This realization did not create shame. Instead, it created compassion. Rachel finally understood that she had been carrying emotional beliefs formed by years of experience rather than objective facts. Hooponopono encouraged her not to fight those memories, not to judge them, and not to pretend they never existed. Instead, she learned to meet them with honesty, humility, and a willingness to let them soften. Each time fear appeared, she no longer rushed to silence it or argue with it. She simply acknowledged that the feeling had been protecting an older version of herself that once believed constant vigilance was necessary for survival. The more gently she responded, the less control those fears seemed to have. She began noticing opportunities she previously overlooked because her attention was no longer consumed by anticipating loss. Conversations about money became less emotionally charged. Planning for the future no longer felt like preparing for disaster. None of this happened overnight, and none of it meant every challenge disappeared. What changed first was the foundation beneath her choices. She was slowly replacing a lifetime of unconscious scarcity with something quieter, steadier, and far more resilient. And although Rachel could not yet see where this path would ultimately lead, she sensed that genuine abundance might begin not with earning more, but with becoming someone who no longer believed that lack defined her future. As the weeks passed, Rachel discovered that the greatest challenge was not learning a new practice. The greatest challenge was remembering to return to it in ordinary moments. It was easy to feel hopeful after reading an inspiring book or listening to a thoughtful discussion. It was much harder when an unexpected expense appeared, when an important email remained unanswered, or when a familiar wave of uncertainty quietly returned without warning. Those were the moments that revealed whether old emotional patterns were still leading her life. One afternoon, Rachel received notice that her apartment lease would increase at the end of the year. Just a few months earlier, that message would have sent her into hours of worry. She would have imagined every possible problem before taking a single practical step. This time she noticed the same rush of anxiety beginning to rise, but instead of allowing it to become the only voice she heard, she paused. She closed her eyes for a few moments and acknowledged the fear without trying to push it away. She understood that the feeling itself was not her enemy. It was simply a familiar response shaped by years of believing that every financial change meant danger. As she quietly reflected, another realization emerged. Fear had often convinced her that immediate emotional reactions were accurate predictions about the future. Yet when she looked honestly at her life, she could remember countless situations where she had worried for days about outcomes that never happened. Her mind had become highly skilled at preparing for loss while paying very little attention to possibility. That realization encouraged her to continue practicing Hooponopono with greater sincerity. Rather than treating the 4 phrases as magical words, she began treating them as an invitation to soften resistance toward the parts of herself that still carried old memories of scarcity. Each repetition became less about changing the outside world and more about restoring peace within her own awareness. Gradually, this inner shift influenced practical decisions in surprising ways. Rachel found herself negotiating with greater confidence instead of assuming rejection before asking. She became more willing to learn new professional skills because she no longer viewed every challenge through the lens of potential failure. She stopped delaying small financial decisions simply because they felt emotionally uncomfortable. None of these actions seemed dramatic on their own, yet together they formed a completely different direction. She finally understood that meaningful transformation rarely arrives through one extraordinary event. More often, It is built through hundreds of quiet moments when a person chooses awareness instead of automatic fear. Looking back, Rachel realized that the invisible cycle had never been sustained by money alone. It had been sustained by repeated emotional habits that quietly shaped every expectation she carried into the future. As those habits slowly lost their influence, she experienced something far more valuable than temporary relief. She began trusting that peace did not have to wait until every financial goal had been achieved. It could exist alongside uncertainty, guiding wiser choices one day at a time, and that growing sense of inner stability became the strongest foundation she had ever known. Around the same time that Rachel was beginning to trust this quieter way of seeing herself, she met Daniel Carter through a local financial wellness workshop. At first glance, Daniel seemed like someone who had everything under control. He dressed professionally, spoke with confidence, and had recently received a promotion at work. Yet during a small group discussion, he admitted something that surprised everyone listening. Despite earning more money than he had ever earned before, he felt no safer than he had 5 years earlier. Every raise briefly brought relief, but within weeks the anxiety returned. He constantly worried that one unexpected event could erase everything he had built. Rachel recognized that feeling immediately because it sounded painfully familiar. After the meeting, Daniel shared more of his story. As a child, he had watched arguments about money become the background noise of everyday life. No one had intended to teach him that financial success created distance between people, but that was the emotional lesson he absorbed. Whenever someone in the family earned more, tensions seemed to increase. Whenever finances became difficult, everyone promised that life would finally become peaceful once there was enough money. Yet enough never seemed to arrive. Without realizing it, Daniel entered adulthood believing two conflicting ideas at the same time. He wanted financial freedom with all his heart, but another part of him quietly associated money with conflict, pressure, and emotional isolation. That hidden conflict shaped countless decisions. He often hesitated before accepting new opportunities because greater responsibility felt emotionally dangerous. He avoided conversations about compensation because he feared being judged as selfish. Even after reaching important career milestones, he rarely celebrated because his attention immediately shifted toward protecting what he had instead of appreciating how far he had come. Rachel listened carefully and realized that although their personal histories were different, the emotional pattern beneath them was remarkably similar. Both had spent years trying to solve external problems while carrying invisible beliefs that quietly pulled them back toward familiar emotional territory. They began discussing what they had learned about observing those patterns instead of automatically obeying them. Daniel admitted that practicing Hooponopono had felt awkward at first because he expected immediate external results. Over time, however, he noticed something more meaningful. The practice slowly reduced the emotional intensity surrounding money. He no longer felt that every financial decision determined his worth as a person. Mistakes became opportunities to learn instead of proof that he would never succeed. Success became something he could receive with gratitude instead of suspicion. Rachel found encouragement in Daniel's experience because it reminded her that genuine transformation often appears internally before becoming visible externally. Their conversations reinforced an important truth. Different childhood experiences can create different stories, yet many people arrive at the same emotional destination, believing that peace depends entirely on circumstances outside themselves. As both Rachel and Daniel continued their separate journeys, they discovered that lasting freedom began the moment they stopped asking fear to guide every financial choice and instead allowed awareness, compassion, and quiet responsibility to become the foundation for a different future. As Rachel and Daniel continued meeting once a week, they realized that real change did not come from collecting more information. It came from practicing a different inner response every time an old emotional pattern appeared. During one conversation, Daniel admitted that he had memorized the 4 Hooponopono phrases weeks earlier, yet he had been repeating them almost mechanically, hoping they would somehow erase years of fear. Rachel smiled because she had done exactly the same thing. They both laughed quietly before recognizing an important truth. The words themselves were never meant to be empty formulas. They were invitations to experience a different relationship with the memories that shaped their lives. Rachel began by reflecting on the first phrase, "I am sorry." She no longer interpreted those words as an admission of personal failure. Instead, she understood them as a moment of honest awareness. She was acknowledging every fearful belief she had unknowingly carried for years, every unconscious expectation of lack, every time she had allowed anxiety to convince her that she was never truly safe. For the first time, she could look at those memories without trying to escape them. Daniel found similar meaning in the second phrase, "Please forgive me." Rather than asking forgiveness from someone outside himself alone, he viewed it as a willingness to release the emotional burden he had continued carrying long after the original experiences had passed. He imagined forgiving the frightened younger version of himself who had believed that money always separated families and that success inevitably created loneliness. He understood that forgiveness was not pretending painful memories never happened. It was choosing not to let them define every future decision. The third phrase, "Thank you," became unexpectedly powerful for both of them. Gratitude no longer depended on reaching a specific income, owning a larger home, or eliminating every financial concern. Instead, gratitude became an acknowledgement that awareness itself was already changing something important. Every moment they recognized an old pattern before reacting to it represented progress that could not be measured by a bank statement alone. Rachel discovered that appreciating these small inner victories made them easier to repeat. Finally came the fourth phrase, "I love you." At first, those words felt the most uncomfortable because both Rachel and Daniel had spent years measuring their worth through performance rather than simple existence. Gradually, however, they began directing those words toward the fearful parts of themselves that had spent decades trying to guarantee survival through constant worry. They realized that lasting peace rarely comes from fighting fear until it disappears. More often, it comes from meeting fear with compassion until it no longer controls every choice. As these four simple phrases became part of ordinary life, neither Rachel nor Daniel expected miracles. They still planned carefully, worked responsibly, and made thoughtful financial decisions. The difference was that those decisions increasingly came from clarity instead of panic. Little by little, they noticed that opportunities felt easier to recognize because their attention was no longer consumed by imagined disasters. The outside world had not fundamentally changed overnight, but the lens through which they experienced that world certainly had. And once that inner lens began to clear, possibilities that had always existed slowly became visible in ways they had never noticed before. As the months passed, neither Rachel nor Daniel described their lives as perfect. Unexpected expenses still appeared. Difficult decisions still had to be made. There were weeks when uncertainty returned with surprising strength. The difference was no longer found in the events themselves. It was found in the way those events were experienced. Rachel noticed this during an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when her car suddenly needed an expensive repair. In the past, a situation like this would have convinced her that she was falling back into the same endless cycle. She would have interpreted one setback as proof that nothing had truly changed. This time she paused before allowing that familiar conclusion to take hold. She recognized the old emotional pattern almost immediately. Her mind wanted to tell the same story it had repeated for years, the story that every unexpected expense meant failure, that every obstacle erased all previous progress, and that security was always slipping away. Instead of believing the story automatically, she chose to observe it with quiet compassion. She reminded herself that a single event did not define an entire future. That simple pause changed everything that followed. Rather than reacting from fear, she calmly reviewed her budget, adjusted a few non-essential expenses, scheduled the repair, and continued with her week. For the first time, a financial challenge remained exactly what it was instead of becoming an emotional identity. Daniel experienced a similar shift at work. A promotion he had hoped to receive was given to someone else. Only a year earlier, he would have viewed that disappointment as evidence that he was not valuable enough, that opportunities always passed him by, and that success belonged to other people. Instead, he noticed the familiar thoughts without allowing them to become permanent conclusions. He quietly practiced the same inner process that Rachel had come to trust. He acknowledged the disappointment, released the urge to define himself through it, and asked what constructive action was available in the present moment. A few days later, he scheduled a conversation with his manager, received thoughtful feedback, and created a clear development plan for the following year. The outcome mattered, but even more important was the fact that fear no longer made every decision on his behalf. Rachel and Daniel gradually realized that the deepest transformation had very little to do with attracting money through force or controlling every circumstance. It had everything to do with ending the constant inner conflict surrounding money itself. For years, they had unknowingly treated money as both the solution to every fear and the source of every fear at the same time. That contradiction had quietly exhausted them. As they continued practicing Hooponopono with sincerity, that contradiction slowly dissolved. Money became a practical resource instead of a measure of personal worth. Financial goals remained important, but they were no longer carrying the impossible responsibility of proving that either of them deserved peace. In that realization, they discovered something unexpectedly freeing. When the heart no longer lives in continuous resistance, the mind becomes clearer, choices become wiser, relationships become healthier, and opportunities become easier to recognize. The external results still required patience, discipline, and consistent action, but those actions were finally growing from a foundation of calm instead of fear. What had once felt like an endless cycle was gradually becoming a completely different direction, not because the world had suddenly become easier, but because they were no longer allowing yesterday's emotional memories to silently write tomorrow's story. By the beginning of the following spring, Rachel noticed something she never would have considered a meaningful victory in the past. She no longer measured every week by the number in her bank account alone. Instead, she began paying attention to the quality of her decisions, the steadiness of her emotions, and the growing sense of trust she carried into situations that once filled her with fear. Ironically, this shift made her more practical than ever before. She reviewed her finances with greater consistency because she no longer associated looking at the numbers with shame. She made long-term plans without assuming they would inevitably fail. She allowed herself to imagine a future built on stability instead of survival. Daniel experienced a similar transformation, although it appeared in a different part of his life. After months of developing new skills and approaching his work with greater confidence rather than quiet anxiety, another leadership opportunity became available. This time he entered the interview without trying to prove that he deserved success. He simply spoke honestly about the value he could contribute. Whether he received the position or not no longer determined his sense of worth. That freedom surprised him more than any promotion ever could. A few days later, he learned that he had been selected for the role. Instead of celebrating with overwhelming relief, he felt something much quieter and much deeper. Gratitude replaced desperation. He realized that the promotion was not the beginning of his transformation. It was one of its natural consequences. Rachel was genuinely happy for him, but Daniel reminded her of something important during one of their conversations. He said that if he had received the same promotion a year earlier, he probably would have carried the same fears into the new position. He would have worried constantly about losing it, disappointing people, or proving himself over and over again. The external opportunity would have been larger, but the internal experience would have remained the same. That observation stayed with Rachel for a long time because it explained why so many people reach goals they once dreamed about and still struggle to experience lasting peace. External achievements can improve circumstances, but they cannot permanently replace the inner beliefs that shape how those circumstances are experienced. The work Rachel and Daniel had been doing through reflection, awareness, and Hooponopono was never about denying the importance of financial responsibility or professional growth. It was about making sure those outward achievements rested on a healthier emotional foundation. Looking back, both of them could clearly identify the first signs that the old cycle had begun to weaken. It was not a sudden increase in income or an unexpected financial breakthrough. It was the moment they stopped allowing fear to define every choice before any evidence existed. They no longer expected disaster as the default future. They no longer confused temporary setbacks with permanent identity. They became more willing to receive help, more willing to recognize opportunities, and more willing to believe that peace did not have to wait for perfect circumstances. Those quiet changes were almost invisible from the outside, yet they gradually influenced every practical decision they made. And as those decisions accumulated day after day, a new pattern slowly emerged, one built not upon scarcity, but upon clarity, responsibility, gratitude, and the quiet confidence that genuine abundance begins within long before it becomes visible without. As summer arrived, Rachel realized that meaningful transformation had become less about extraordinary moments and more about the quiet routines that shaped ordinary days. She no longer searched for dramatic breakthroughs because she understood that lasting change was built through consistent awareness. Daniel felt the same. During one of their weekly conversations, he smiled and admitted that he no longer woke up wondering whether life would finally change. Instead, he woke up asking a different question. What kind of thoughts would he choose to strengthen today? Rachel appreciated that question because it reflected how much both of them had grown. They had stopped waiting for confidence to appear before taking action. They had learned that confidence often followed repeated acts of awareness. Together, they created a simple daily rhythm that helped them remain grounded without becoming complicated. Every morning before looking at emails, financial reports, or news headlines, they spent a few quiet minutes sitting comfortably and allowing their breathing to slow naturally. Rather than forcing positive thoughts, they simply noticed whatever emotions were already present. If worry appeared, they acknowledged it without judgment. If gratitude appeared, they welcomed it without trying to hold on to it. If uncertainty appeared, they treated it with the same kindness they would offer a close friend. Only after becoming aware of their emotional state did they quietly practice the 4 Hooponopono phrases with genuine intention. Rachel found that the practice became more meaningful when she connected each phrase to a specific feeling instead of repeating the words automatically. Daniel noticed something similar. The more sincere his attention became, the less power old emotional reactions seemed to have over his decisions throughout the day. They also adopted another simple habit. Whenever an unexpected financial concern appeared, neither of them rushed into immediate action. Instead, they paused for a few slow breaths before making any important decision. That brief moment interrupted the automatic cycle that had once connected every challenge with fear. Sometimes the practical solution was exactly the same as it would have been in the past, but now it came from clarity rather than emotional urgency. Rachel was surprised by how many unnecessary worries disappeared simply because she no longer treated every fearful thought as an accurate prediction. Daniel experienced the same shift in his professional life. Meetings that once felt intimidating gradually became opportunities for thoughtful conversation because he no longer entered the room believing he had to prove his value. Looking back over the previous year, both of them realized that abundance had quietly gained a new meaning. It was no longer defined only by income, possessions, or external success. Abundance had become the ability to meet uncertainty without surrendering inner peace, to make wise decisions without constant panic, and to receive both opportunities and challenges without allowing either one to determine personal worth. Ironically, this healthier relationship with themselves also improved their relationship with money because their choices became more consistent, more patient, and more intentional. They finally understood that genuine freedom was not created by eliminating every uncertainty from life. It was created by no longer allowing uncertainty to control the direction of the heart. From that place of quiet stability, the future no longer appeared as something to fear, but as something they were finally prepared to meet with wisdom, compassion, and hope. By the time another year began, neither Rachel nor Daniel described themselves as completely different people. Instead, they spoke about becoming more fully themselves, free from many of the fears that had quietly directed their lives for so long. Their financial circumstances had improved through consistent work, thoughtful planning, and wiser decisions. But when friends asked what had changed the most, neither of them mentioned a specific dollar amount. Rachel would simply smile and say that she no longer woke up believing she had to fight life before breakfast. Daniel would quietly explain that he had stopped measuring his value by every success or setback. Those answers often surprised people because they expected practical techniques instead of inner transformation. Yet both Rachel and Daniel understood something that had taken years to discover. Lasting external progress becomes far more sustainable when it grows from an internal foundation of peace instead of fear. Looking back, Rachel realized that the invisible cycle had not been broken by a single extraordinary event. It had been weakened one ordinary choice at a time. Every moment she questioned an old belief instead of automatically believing it. Every moment she responded with awareness instead of panic. Every moment she treated herself with compassion instead of criticism. Those seemingly small moments accumulated until they quietly created a completely different direction for her life. Daniel experienced the same truth. He remembered believing that confidence would arrive only after achieving enough success. Instead, he discovered that genuine confidence began the moment he stopped asking external circumstances to decide whether he was worthy of respect. Once that change occurred, he became more willing to learn, more willing to adapt, more willing to receive opportunities, and more willing to recover from disappointment without allowing it to define his future. They both came to understand that Hooponopono was never about pretending that challenges did not exist. Bills still had to be paid. Careers still required effort. Relationships still needed honesty and patience. The practice simply reminded them that every experience first passed through the condition of the heart. When the heart remained trapped by fear, even good opportunities could feel threatening. When the heart gradually found peace, even difficult seasons could become opportunities for wisdom and growth. Perhaps the greatest lesson they carried forward was this: every person inherits stories about money, success, security, and worth. Some of those stories encourage growth, while others quietly create invisible limits. The remarkable truth is that inherited stories do not have to become permanent identities. They can be recognized. They can be questioned. They can be met with compassion instead of shame. And over time, they can lose the power they once held. Rachel no longer believed that her future had already been written by the fears of her past. Daniel no longer believed that peace depended on perfect circumstances. Both of them continued moving forward with practical responsibility, steady effort, and quiet gratitude, knowing that true abundance begins the moment a person no longer allows yesterday's emotional memories to become tomorrow's expectations. From that place, each new day became more than another chance to earn a living. It became another opportunity to live with greater awareness, greater freedom, and a deeper trust that the most meaningful transformation always begins within.